When the mind conjures the image of an empire, it inevitably pictures armies, conquests, and maps stained in imperial hues. Yet, the 20th century birthed a new breed of dominion. This was an order that required no soldiers, only signatures. It was not legions marching upon cities, but men in bespoke suits descending upon capitals, loan agreements tucked discreetly in their briefcases. Nowhere was this shadow empire more visible than in Latin America. There, the International Monetary Fund did not merely lend money. It rewrote entire economies, dictated the fate of nations, and reshaped the destiny of hundreds of millions. All in the name of stability, but in truth, all in the service of creditors. The paradox is striking. When the IMF was forged at Bretton Woods in 1944, its mission was to be the financial world's physician, to heal, to stabilize, to help nations rise from the ashes of war. But in Latin America, this doctor transformed into something else entirely. A ruthless debt collector, ensuring that the vaults of New York and London were replenished no matter the cost to the patient. To fully grasp the magnitude of this shadow empire, one must also look behind the curtain at the lenders themselves. The crisis of the 1980s was not merely a story of Latin American profligacy. It was a story of reckless gambling by the titans of Wall Street. In the years leading up to the crash, bankers operated under the arrogant assumption, famously articulated by Walter Wriston of Citibank, that countries do not go bankrupt. This belief emboldened them to push loans upon sovereign nations with the aggression of drug pushers, ignoring basic risk assessments in favor of quarterly bonuses. When the house of cards finally collapsed, the IMF did not truly step in to save Mexico or Brazil. It stepped in to save the American banking system. If Latin America had defaulted entirely, the shockwaves would have toppled the pillars of New Y. To understand this tragedy, one must step back into the mid-century. Nations like Brazil, Mexico, and Argentina were racing to modernize. They built industries, expanded state enterprises, and subsidized bread and fuel to maintain social peace. Politicians promised the prosperity of today, paying for it with the credit of tomorrow, and tomorrow's bill would be massive. In the 1970s, the world was awash in cheap money. Petrodollars piled up in Western banks, and those banks were desperate to lend. Latin American leaders seized the opportunity. They borrowed in dollars to build roads, dams, and factories. It appeared to be a miracle. But every age of illusion has its end. In the early 1980s, the winds shifted. The United States raised interest rates to the sky to crush inflation. Overnight, those cheap loans turned into crushing burdens. A loan that once demanded 5% interest now demanded 20%. In 1982, Mexico raised the white flag, declaring to the world, "We cannot pay," and the IMF was waiting at the door. The terms were absolute. Governments were forced to slash subsidies on food and fuel, devalue their currencies, and freeze wages. National budgets were no longer penned in the halls of Mexico City or Buenos Aires, but in offices in Washington, D.C. For the politicians, the IMF was a convenient shield. They could turn to their people and say, "We have no choice. The hand is forced." The result was brutal. The years between 1980 and 1990 became known as the Lost Decade. Poverty exploded, and the chasm of inequality deepened. Riots erupted in Caracas. Protests shook Buenos Aires. The IMF presented itself as a neutral arbiter, a technocrat, but the truth was stark. They were there to protect the system, to ensure that money and power flowed upward. This region served as a grim laboratory. In Bolivia, they applied shock therapy. Inflation fell, yes, but at the cost of profound human misery. Argentina became the model student of the 90s, following every rule, only to collapse in 2001, with citizens losing their life savings overnight. The austerity tested here was later exported to Asia, to Russia, and eventually to Greece. What began as a Latin American tragedy became a global doctrine. This is not merely a history lesson, it is a warning. Today, nations like Greece, Italy, and even the United States carry debt loads that would have terrified the Latin American leaders of the past. Debt is not just a number on a ledger. It is a form of control. Sovereignty is eroded not by invasions, but by spreadsheets. History, they say, does not repeat, but it rhymes. The shadow of the IMF in Latin America teaches us a crucial lesson. Real wealth is not the illusion promised by a system you do not control. Real wealth is assets that hold value, skills that cannot be devalued, and communities that cannot be privatized. Remember, debt is leverage, and the hand on that lever is rarely your own. When politicians speak of tough choices, remember the lost decade, and remember who truly pays the price. To fully grasp the magnitude of this shadow empire, one must peel back yet another layer and look at what crawled out of the wreckage. If the bankers of the 1970s were reckless gamblers, the entities that followed them were calculated predators. As the dust settled on the sovereign bankruptcies of the late 20th century, a new breed of financial actor emerged, evolved specifically to feast on the dying, the vulture funds. These are not banks in the traditional sense. They do not accept deposits from grandmothers or lend money to build bridges. They are specialized, hyper-aggressive hedge funds that circle distressed nations like scavengers waiting for a wounded animal to collapse. Their business model is chillingly simple and morally bankrupt. They identify a country on the brink of default, be it Peru, Congo, or Argentina, and buy its debt bonds on the secondary market for pennies on the dollar, sometimes as little as 10 cents. Then, unlike traditional lenders who might negotiate a haircut to help the country recover, these funds refuse any settlement. They wait. They sue. They demand 100% repayment plus compound interest. It is a form of financial alchemy that turns the misery of millions into billions for a handful of billionaires in Connecticut and New York. The most cinematic and terrifying example of this power dynamic occurred not in a boardroom, but on the high seas. In 2012, the ARA Libertad, a majestic three-masted frigate and the historic pride of the Argentine Navy, docked in a port in Ghana. It was a diplomatic mission. But suddenly, the crew found themselves held hostage. The ship was impounded, not by a hostile nation's navy, but by a court order obtained by NML Capital, a hedge fund managed by the American billionaire Paul Singer. Imagine the scene. A sovereign warship, a symbol of national defense and pride, seized like a repossessed Toyota Camry because a speculator in Manhattan wanted his payout. This was the moment the mask fell off completely. It demonstrated to the global South that in the hierarchy of the New World Order, the profit margins of a private hedge fund held more legal weight than the sovereign immunity of a G20 nation. It was juridical colonialism. In the 19th century, empires sent gunboats to collect debts. In the 21st century, the creditors seized the gunboats themselves using lawyers. But the empire of debt has not just become more aggressive, it has become more insidious. As we moved into the new millennium, the Washington Consensus faced a rebellion. A pink tide of leftist leaders across Latin America tried to break free, paying off the IMF early to escape its suffocating conditionalities. For a brief moment, Aided by a historic boom in commodities like soy, copper, and oil, it seemed the region might reclaim its destiny. But this independence was a mirage. The fundamental structure of the global economy had not changed. Only the creditors had. Today, the men in suits are being replaced by new geopolitical giants and faceless algorithms. China has entered the stage, lending hundreds of billions for infrastructure through the Belt and Road Initiative. On the surface, it looks like development. Airports, dams, and railways rise from the jungle. But underneath, it is a repeat of the 1970s trap, only with opaque terms and collateral that often includes the very land and ports the money was meant to develop. The actors change, but the script remains the same. Resources for credit. Furthermore, debt has migrated from bank loans to bond markets. This shift is crucial and dangerous. In the 1980s, a finance minister could sit in a room with a committee of 10 bankers and negotiate a restructuring. Today, a country's debt is pulverized and held by thousands of anonymous investors, pension funds, and high-frequency trading algorithms scattered across the globe. You cannot negotiate with an algorithm. You cannot ask a trading bot for mercy or explain that cutting healthcare will kill children. The master has become invisible, diffused into the very atmosphere of the global markets. This invisibility brings us to the domestic tragedy of our time. The logic of the IMF, privatize, commodify, financialize, has migrated north. The structural adjustment programs that gutted Latin America are now being applied to the citizens of the developed world. We are witnessing the Latin Americanization of the middle class in Europe and the United States. Consider the student debt crisis in America or the housing crisis in Europe. The mechanism is identical to the sovereign debt traps of the past. Young people are encouraged to borrow massive sums against a promised future of prosperity. Go to university, they are told. It is an investment. But when the economy shifts, when wages stagnate, they are trapped in a cycle of servitude. The citizen is transformed into a mini-state, perpetually balancing a deficit, borrowing from the future to survive the present, terrified of the